So in our first two modules, we looked at power, and now we brought in identity. Let's try and bring them together a bit. So all societies will have some structure of power, and they'll have some structure of identities. To keep things simple, so here's our structure, and we'll do power, and we'll also do identity. And we'll think of just three levels: national, above national, and below national, subnational. Both power and identities can be lodged anywhere along these spectra. Let's start with a practical example of the Roman Empire. Long time ago, one of the most amazing empires the world's known. Where was power? Well, not much doubt. Power was above the level of the nation. Here's Rome. So, supranational power. Where was identity? It certainly wasn't national, because in Roman times, a couple of thousand years ago, there weren't things called nations. So where was identity? When the Romans first occupied a territory, identity was subnational. That is a very big mismatch between where power lies and where identities lie. And that's going to create difficulties. For example, when the Romans arrived in Britain, there was no such thing as British identity. There were just a lot of tribes. Indeed, the Romans used a conquering technique in which they got one or two of the tribes to back the Romans, because the tribes hated each other more than they hated the Romans. But the big challenge when you've got a mismatch as big as that between power and identity is it's going to be hard to get authority. It's hard to get power to turn into authority. Power wants to get its own way. It tells people what to do. Sometimes it's in their own interest, then it's not very interesting, but sometimes power is trying to get people to do things that they don't want to do. They either comply or they don't. What we mean by authority is where people choose to obey without a lot of effort. So compliance becomes semi-automatic. When power and identity are really very different, it's hard to get compliance. You've actually only got three choices. If power hasn't turned into authority, what can you do about it? Well, you can force people. That's repression. The Romans were pretty good on that one. Right? You don't comply, we kill you. But that is very expensive. Very expensive. You need a lot of military force. For example, when the Romans got to Britain, they marched around Scotland and decided all these clans, not much economic value in the land, it's just not worth occupying this territory. The cost of enforcing compliance in what's now Scotland is just too high. And so instead they built a wall. If you try and repress people to force compliance, but you haven't got enough hard power, what happens is people push back, and then you get open conflict. The Romans had quite a lot of that. In some territories, they just pushed too far, and so they were constantly facing uprisings. That, very expensive. You don't get compliance, but you do have to spend the money on the military. And then the third possibility, where power hasn't turned into authority, so it's very hard to get compliance, the third possibility is you give up. Power dissolves into theatre. You still issue directives, but you don't really expect them to be followed. And so you're performing acts as if you were a government, but it's like an actor on a stage. Everybody connives at it, but it's not real exercise of power. That was the Roman Empire. A modern example of a big mismatch between power and identity is the European Union. Again, power is up here. Where's identity in the European Union? Overwhelmingly at the level of the nation. Britain, having had a referendum where a majority actually decided to leave the Union because of this tension, identities are down here, and they didn't like power being up here. The slogan was "Take back control." But actually, there isn't that much power in Brussels. This mismatch is more an example of power as theatre. A good example would be during the refugee crisis, Brussels put out directives requiring the nations of Europe to take refugees. Those directives were essentially universally ignored. And so that was power as theatre.